The bank manager looked at his ID, then at his space, then back at his ID. "Sir, I'm going to need you to prove this is really your account." What he didn't know? He wasn't just any customer. He was the CEO who built the bank from the ground up. Marcus Rivera stepped through the glass doors of Liberty Trust Bank on a humid Tuesday afternoon. The air conditioning hit him immediately, a sharp contrast to the sweltering heat outside. His worn sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished marble floor as he adjusted his faded denim jacket over a simple white t-shirt. This wasn't how Marcus usually dressed for anything bank-related. No tailored suit, no Italian leather shoes, no gold watch catching the light. Today he looked like any other working-class customer walking into the downtown branch of the financial empire he'd built from nothing. 23 years ago, Marcus had started Liberty Trust with a single mission: make banking accessible to everyone, regardless of their background or appearance. He'd grown up in these same streets watching his immigrant parents get turned away from loan applications, treated like second-class citizens despite working 3 jobs between them. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Marcus approached the customer service counter, his eyes scanning the familiar layout. Every detail had been his decision: the warm lighting, the comfortable seating area, even the motivational posters featuring diverse faces. He'd personally approved the hiring of every employee in this branch, including the young man now looking up at him with barely concealed impatience. "Can I help you?" asked the teller, his name tag reading Dylan Martinez. His tone carried that specific brand of politeness that felt more like a barrier than a welcome. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying none of the authority it held in boardrooms. $5,000 from my checking account." Dylan slid a clipboard across the marble counter without making eye contact. "Fill this out completely. I'll need 2 forms of ID." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. 2 forms of ID for a $5,000 withdrawal wasn't standard policy. He knew because he'd written the policies himself. But he pulled out his driver's license and credit card anyway, placing them beside the completed form. That's when everything changed. Dylan picked up the ID, his eyes narrowing as he studied the photo, then looked up at Marcus with obvious skepticism. The air in the bank seemed to shift, becoming heavier, more charged. Marcus felt it immediately, that familiar tension he'd hoped he'd never experience in his own establishment. "This is interesting," Dylan muttered, loud enough for Marcus to hear but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. He disappeared behind a frosted glass partition, taking Marcus's identification with him. Marcus stood there, his hands resting calmly on the counter despite the storm building inside his chest. Around him, other customers moved through their transactions smoothly. An elderly white woman received her cashier's check with smiles and pleasantries. A young professional in an expensive suit got his account balance with casual efficiency. But Marcus waited and waited. 10 minutes passed before Dylan returned, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked Trevor Chen, the branch manager, a man Marcus had personally interviewed and hired 18 months earlier. Trevor's expression was carefully neutral, but Marcus caught the way his eyes assessed him from head to toe. "Good afternoon, Mr." Trevor paused, glancing down at the paperwork. "Rivera. I understand you're trying to make a substantial withdrawal today." $5,000 isn't substantial, and I'm not trying to do anything. I'm a customer making a routine transaction." Trevor's smile was thin, professional, and completely hollow. "Of course, we just need to verify a few things, security purposes. You understand." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Security purposes, the same phrase banks had used to discriminate against his parents, his neighbors, his community for decades. The same phrase he had specifically trained his staff never to use unless there was genuine cause for concern. "What exactly needs verifying?" Marcus asked. "I've provided identification, account information, and filled out your form." "Well," Trevor said, drawing out the word as he examined Marcus's driver's license under a small UV light, "this is quite a bit of money. We need to make sure everything is legitimate." The UV light. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. That device was reserved for suspected fraud cases, not routine withdrawals. He watched Trevor's performance, recognizing it for what it was: theater designed to make him feel unwelcome, unwanted, unworthy. "Is there a problem with my identification?" Marcus asked, his voice remaining steady despite the fire building behind his ribs. "Oh, no problem," Trevor said quickly. "Just being thorough. You can never be too careful these days." He paused, studying Marcus again. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Rivera?" "I work in finance," Marcus said simply. "Finance?" Trevor repeated, as if tasting the word. "What kind of finance?" Marcus felt the familiar weight of having to prove himself, justify his existence, explain his right to be treated with basic human dignity. But instead of anger, he felt something else building, a cold, calculating clarity. The kind that pays well enough to afford a $5,000 withdrawal. He met Trevor's gaze directly. Trevor's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been embarrassment, but he recovered quickly, falling back on the script Marcus knew by heart. "I'm going to need to speak with my supervisor. This is unusual." "What's unusual about it?" "Well, the amount, the account details, and frankly, you don't look like our typical high-balance customer." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Around them, the bank had grown quieter. Other customers were starting to notice the commotion, phones appearing in hands, recording devices emerging from pockets. The story was already spreading beyond these walls, taking on a life of its own in the digital realm where injustice traveled at the speed of light. Marcus stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it, the choice point. He could reveal who he was right now, end this humiliation immediately, or he could let it play out, see exactly how far his own employees would go. "You don't look like our typical customer," Marcus repeated slowly, letting the words sink in. "And what exactly does your typical customer look like?" Trevor's face reddened. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" The bank had gone almost silent now. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Marcus could feel eyes on him, customers, employees, security cameras recording every second of this encounter. That's when Trevor made his fatal mistake. He reached under the counter and pressed the silent alarm. The response was immediate. 2 security guards appeared from seemingly nowhere, one from the back office, another from near the entrance. They moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves on either side of Marcus without a word. Marcus looked at them calmly, recognizing both faces. James Washington, the senior guard he'd personally commended last year for helping an elderly customer who had fallen in the parking lot. Anthony Patel, who had been with the company for 3 years and had never been written up for excessive force or inappropriate conduct. "Gentlemen," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying an odd mix of disappointment and curiosity. "Is this really necessary?" James shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about the situation. Anthony looked between Marcus and Trevor, his hand resting on his radio, but not moving to call for backup. "Sir, we just want to make sure everyone stays calm." "I'm perfectly calm. The question is whether Mr. Chen here can say the same." Trevor was sweating now, despite the air conditioning. He'd committed to this course of action, but Marcus could see the doubt creeping in around the edges of his certainty. The problem with discrimination is that it requires constant reinforcement of false narratives, and those narratives start to crumble under scrutiny. "Look," Trevor said, his voice slightly higher than before, "this is just standard procedure for large withdrawals. If you could just provide some additional verification." "What additional verification?" Marcus cut him off. "I've shown you my ID, provided my account number, filled out your form." "Well, employment verification would be helpful. Pay stub, perhaps, or..." "A pay stub?" Marcus repeated the words slowly, letting them sink in. "You want me to provide employment verification to withdraw money from my own account?" Around them, customers were openly staring now. I could hear whispered conversations, see phones being raised to capture the scene. The story was already spreading beyond these walls, taking on a life of its own in the digital realm, where injustice traveled at the speed of light. Dylan, the original teller, had retreated to a workstation, but kept glancing over nervously. Marcus caught his eye and saw something there. Recognition, maybe, were the dawning awareness that this situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had intended. Mr. Chen, Marcus said, his voice taking on a different quality now, still quiet, but with an undertone of steel that made everyone within earshot pay attention. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Are you refusing to process my withdrawal? Trevor hesitated. In that hesitation, Marcus saw everything he needed to know. This wasn't about policies or procedures or security concerns. This was about power, control, and the assumption that someone who looked like Marcus didn't deserve the same respect as other customers. I'm not refusing anything, Trevor said. I'm just following protocol. Whose protocol? Company protocol, Liberty Trust policy. Marcus felt something shift inside him, not anger exactly, but a cold, focused clarity. Trevor had just invoked his own company's policies against him, policies Marcus had written specifically to prevent exactly this kind of...
What kind of training issues? The kind where your branch manager just called security on a customer trying to make a routine withdrawal. The kind where your staff are demanding employment verification for standard transactions. The kind where company policy is being used to justify discrimination. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Marcus could practically hear Patricia's mind racing, connecting dots, realizing implications. "Marcus," she said finally, her voice tight with understanding, "are you telling me that Trevor called security on you?" And there it was, the moment when everything changed. Trevor's face went from pale to ashen. Dylan dropped the papers he'd been shuffling. The security guards looked at each other with growing comprehension and horror. "Wait," Trevor stammered. "Marcus? As in Marcus Rivera," Marcus said calmly, ending the phone call and sliding the device back into his pocket. "Founder and CEO of Liberty Trust Bank. The person who hired you, Mr. Chen, the person who approved this branch's budget, signed off on your salary, and personally designed the customer service protocols you just violated." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the kind of silence that comes after an explosion, when the smoke is clearing and everyone is trying to assess the damage. Marcus looked around the branch, his branch, and saw his vision reflected back at him in twisted form. The diverse staff he'd hired, the inclusive policies he'd implemented, the welcoming environment he'd created, all of it undermined by the very prejudices he'd built the company to combat. "James," he said quietly, addressing the senior security guard, "Anthony, you both know me. You've seen me in this building dozens of times. Did either of you think to question why you were being called to intimidate a customer making a routine transaction?" James looked stricken. "Sir, we were told there was a security issue. And you didn't think to assess that security issue yourselves? You just assumed that a man trying to withdraw money from his own account posed a threat." Neither guard responded. What could they say? They'd followed orders without thinking, become complicit in exactly the kind of treatment Marcus had founded the company to eliminate. Marcus turned to Dylan, who was now visibly shaking. "Mr. Martinez, you were the first person I interacted with today. You took my identification, saw my account information, and immediately decided I needed additional scrutiny. Can you explain why?" Dylan's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He was young, maybe 23, and clearly unprepared for this level of accountability. But unprepared didn't mean innocent. I don't know, sir. The amount seemed what? Too large for someone who looks like me to handle legitimately?" Dylan's silence was answer enough. Finally, Marcus turned back to Trevor, who had gone from confident authority figure to cornered animal in the span of 30 seconds. "Mr. Chen, you called security on your own CEO for trying to access his personal banking account. You demanded employment verification that isn't required by any policy I've ever written. You used company procedure as justification for discriminatory treatment. And you did all of this while representing my company, my values, and my name." Trevor tried to speak, but Marcus held up a hand. "I'm not finished. You see, I came here today specifically to observe how our staff treats customers who don't fit certain expectations. I dressed down, came in quietly, wanted to see if the inclusive culture we've worked so hard to build actually exists at the ground level. Marcus gestured around the branch, where customers and employees alike were hanging on every word. What I found is that despite all our training, all our policies, all our stated values, discrimination is alive and well in my own company. And that ends today. Marcus walked to the center of the lobby, his presence now commanding the space in a way it hadn't before. The transformation was remarkable. The same man, the same clothes, but suddenly everyone could see the authority that had been there all along. For those of you who don't know, he said to the room at large, I grew up 6 blocks from here. My parents were immigrants who worked 3 jobs between them and still got treated like criminals every time they walked into a bank. They were denied loans, questioned about their income, made to feel like they didn't belong in institutions that were supposed to serve them. His voice carried easily through the space, seasoned by years of presentations and board meetings. I founded Liberty Trust to be different. I hired diverse staff, implemented inclusive policies, and created an environment where everyone, regardless of race, class, or appearance, would be treated with dignity and respect. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the faces watching him. But policies don't change hearts. Training doesn't eliminate bias. And apparently, having good intentions isn't enough to prevent the very discrimination I built this company to fight. He turned back to Trevor, who was now surrounded by customers recording every moment with their phones. Mr. Chen, you are fired. Effective immediately. The words landed like a physical blow. Trevor's knees actually buckled slightly. Sir, please, I can explain. There's nothing to explain. Marcus cut him off. You had multiple opportunities to treat me with basic human dignity. Instead, you chose to escalate, to intimidate, to discriminate. Those choices have consequences. He addressed James and Anthony next. Gentlemen, you'll both be suspended pending a full review of this incident. Security personnel are supposed to de-escalate situations, not create them. Following orders isn't an excuse for abandoning judgment. Both guards nodded grimly, understanding they'd participated in something indefensible. Marcus turned to Dylan, who was now visibly shaking. Mr. Martinez, you'll be enrolled in immediate bias training and placed on probation. This is your chance to learn from this experience and do better. Dylan nodded rapidly, relief and shame warring on his young face. Marcus pulled out his phone again, this time calling his head of human resources. Sarah, it's Marcus. I need you to send a team to the downtown branch immediately. We're implementing emergency bias training for all staff, and I want a complete review of our customer service procedures. He paused, looking around the room. And I want every customer who witnessed today's events to receive a personal apology and account credit for the inconvenience. As he ended the call, Marcus noticed an elderly black woman who'd been sitting in the waiting area throughout the entire incident. She was nodding approvingly, her eyes bright with recognition and understanding. Excuse me, ma'am, he said, approaching her. I'm sorry you had to witness this. She smiled, standing slowly. Honey, I'm not sorry at all. I'm 82 years old, and I've been waiting my whole life to see someone with power use it the right way. She patted his arm gently. Your parents would be proud. The comment hit him harder than anything else that had happened. This wasn't just about corporate policies or customer service training. This was about legacy, about the dreams of people who'd worked and sacrificed so their children could build something better. As the immediate chaos began to settle, Marcus found himself standing in the same spot where he'd been humiliated just an hour before. But everything had changed. Not just the atmosphere in the bank, but something fundamental about how he understood his own company and his role in leading it. Trevor was escorted from the building by security, his keys and access cards surrendered, his career at Liberty Trust over permanently. Marcus felt no satisfaction in the firing, only sadness that it had been necessary. Patricia Newman arrived within 20 minutes, her expression grim but determined. She immediately began coordinating the response: customer outreach, media management, staff retraining, policy review. This incident would ripple through the entire organization, forcing uncomfortable conversations and necessary changes. "How long has this been happening?" Marcus asked her quietly as they watched the branch slowly return to normal operations. "I wish I could say this was isolated, but if I'm being completely honest, probably longer than either of us wants to admit." Marcus nodded, appreciating her directness. Change couldn't begin with comfortable lies. Over the next several hours, as news of the incident spread through social media outlets and local news outlets, Marcus received dozens of calls and messages. Some were supportive, praising him for taking action. Others were critical, suggesting he'd been too harsh or had orchestrated the entire thing for publicity. He ignored most of them, focusing instead on the work ahead. This incident had revealed cracks in the foundation of everything he'd built. Now came the harder task of repairing those cracks and building something stronger. That evening, Marcus returned to his office and drafted a company-wide memo. It began, "Today, I experienced firsthand the discrimination that our policies are designed to prevent. The failure wasn't in our procedures. It was in our commitment to those procedures when they conflicted with unconscious bias and societal prejudice." He went on to announce mandatory bias training for all employees, the creation of a customer advocacy position, and a comprehensive review of all branch operations. But more than that, he committed to regular undercover visits, ensuring that the values Liberty Trust claimed to represent were actually being lived